make the radius correct, stuff like that. You just turn on hybrid mode, you reload your game, and you'll be able to see the bodies of the physics objects. Okay, game is, if main Lua is the entry point for the game itself is loaded by Corona, the file game in the scripts folder is the entry point for our game. It's got all the logic that builds up the world, the level that we're starting on. It uses modules external to it, but it's sort of like brings it all together. So we're going to take a look at that. But on line 41, or I'm sorry, line 38, I basically require the module, and then I call one function on it called create, and I pass in a number. Currently, I only have one level defined, so this is basically the number of the level file. Speaking of which, last week I showed you the level files, and of course I'm loading level 0, which is my template. Sorry, give me 1 second. One. All right. Yes. So last week, this may look familiar. I showed you this file, and basically what it's got is a table where I've got a bunch of underbars and some other stuff, and you can still ignore this. By all means, dig into it, play with it, but we're not going to talk about it this week other than for me to say that this is going through some changes as I try to find the best way of expressing the levels in such a way that people can edit them and understand what's going on, and so that they're flexible enough for me to do things like add coins and mark the positions of the monsters and stuff like that. And I'm still playing around with it, so this has changed, and I expect it to change a little bit more while I get my head wrapped around the best way of doing this so that people can understand it.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to remember that you are looking at a game that has been created by someone else and then reproducing it based on how you think it does work or should work. So we're not really privy to any existing code from that game.
And I don't have the whole design in my head yet.
Right.
So this is a very much an organically progressing design, which means in a nutshell, my favorite phrase of the month, it seems like, that the design of this game, as we go along in these talks, will change. I'm keeping previous versions so you can look at them and see what the differences are. And each version will work independently, but the final version we get to may be and will be very different from where we started as I try to make this as consumable to this audience who is listening as possible. Okay, so game. I guess I should make one more statement. One thing I like to do when I do game prototypes, and I suggest people do this very early, is invariably the way I make a game that has multiple levels is I will create one level and I will test it. But then I know that I'm going to destroy that level in the future when I'm doing like the final game and then load the next level, destroy that level, load the next level. So very early on, I put the code in place to destroy the level and I test it. Because nothing is worse. I see this all the time in the forums. People design their game, they work on it really hard, they get it very complicated level designs or whatever they're doing, and then they need to switch scenes or they need to load the next level and they go, oh, okay, well this should all just work. And they do the part of their code that's supposed to do the destroying and everything falls apart. And the reason it falls apart is because they didn't test it progressively as they went along. So in my game design, what I always do is I test the destroy function. So what I've done here is basically called create, and create itself calls destroy, as I'll show you. And when I run this, what it does is I play with it, I'm doing it, and 3 seconds later it reloads the first level. Didn't crash, all the buttons are still working, I'm satisfied. Now there may still be bugs in there, but that was a test of 90% of the functionality that I needed to make sure works. So I'm not going to get surprised later. So typically when I go along, I'll just uncomment this one line here and make sure that everything is still working as I add more and more features and touch handlers and listeners and all that stuff. Okay, so quick tour is done. Game Lua is the big dog as far as organization, and at the top here, basically what I've done is required some libraries. It's a module, so you'll see that I use the typical module design. Is that me? typical module design, and I create a table, just a blank table, and then I just write my code. I require some files that I need, some other modules that I'm using, and then here you'll see that I create functions attached to the module. Remember, the table was called public. I could have called it anything. And then at the very end of the file, I return that table. So that allows me in other files to require game, as I did here, which returns a reference to the table. I store it in a variable called game. I could have called it anything. And then I can call the create function, which was defined in game. So I won't go over that again, but I just want people to be sort of like at the right starting point here. So this is our create function. As we saw, it takes a number. What it does basically is the first thing I do is I call destroy on the assumption that I'm loading a new level. The first time around, there's nothing to destroy, so the function, which we'll see later, won't achieve anything. It'll still run through the steps it's supposed to, but it doesn't actually do anything useful. But on subsequent loads, it would in fact destroy the contents of the world. The contents of our world, our game world, are all going to be placed in a bunch of display groups. And so step 2 in this game here is creating a bunch of display groups and organizing them in such a way that I know that the group called overlay is on the top, content is in the middle, and underlay is underneath everything else. It's just my own naming structure. You could use any kind of naming structure you want. I also like to approach this in that I create a group called layers, and then I create the 3 other groups that are the named groups, and I insert all of these other groups into the one group called layers, and I also create fields or variables on layers with the same name as the group. So throughout my code, I can do stuff like create a new rectangle and put it in the underlay group by saying layers.underlay. So I'm just referring to that group. And then later when I destroy the display groups, I can simply display remove, call display.remove, like here, and destroy the top layers group, which is the one that contains all my sublayers, and destroy them all at once, and all of the references. So it's a very easy cleanup methodology for me. It's very structured and organized, and it's just accessible, and I like to do it that way. However, people may do this as they will. They could create individual layer names. I don't know. This is my suggestion, is try to approach it this way, understand what I've done, and I think you'll find this quite useful. All right, exciting. We draw a blue background, which is basically what we're seeing here. Nothing too much there. And then the really important step here is just a few lines of code. What we do is we require another module called level loader, which is, we're not going into what it looks like right now because it's very complicated and it's changing. But in essence, it reads these files and then converts these entries into bigger table entries that have more details, and then it feeds those into individual modules, which we haven't looked at yet, to build the world content. So we start small, we convert this into more detailed records, and we take those records and we build the individual pieces that are in our world, and then they get inserted into layers content, which we're not seeing here because the builders themselves are doing the work. But the nice thing about this is, by organizing it this way, we can use one module to convert the level description into a more detailed level description, and then we can simply get that data and pass it into these individual builders, which we saw that we loaded up here. So we've got a builder for the player, we got a builder for the round parts in the world and the squares, and we'll have more builders as we go, as I add more components to this game.